Those two tools together helped us like build this kind of like CI Rube Goldberg machine where it would like, you would do it and the bots would just like open these PRs and merge them and publish and do all this stuff.
Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. We're a bunch of developers talking about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew Lazowski, and this is my co-host.
I'm Justin Bennett.
And we're going to be talking about monorepo tooling today, something that both me and Justin have used quite a lot in our development careers. So first, let's start off with introducing ourselves. I'm Andrew Lazowski. I'm the maintainer of Auto, an open source tool for automating your releases, and I do a lot of front-end code. What about you, Justin?
Yeah, so again, Justin, I currently am an employee at Artsy, but not for much longer. I'll be going off to Recurse Center to sort of explore and build some interesting things. But yeah, I have a similar sort of background. I end up doing a lot of both tooling, front-end stuff, performance-related work, sort of whatever I get into. But yeah, this space of dev tooling is sort of like near and dear to both of our hearts, and it's actually how we met. So back when the Intuit team was early in like publishing Auto, Artsy was going through our own sorts of problems, and maybe it'd be good to talk about like what Auto is and what you use it for.
Yeah, so Auto started out at Intuit as literally just like a bash script that we included in projects, and then one of my coworkers actually coded it, and then when I saw it, I was like, wow, this makes just publishing things so much easier. Previously, it had been something that I was like even kind of scared of to even broach the topic of publishing, because there was a lot that goes into that. So we built Auto, which is a TypeScript tool with a plugin system that allows you to automate all the different parts of your release. So that is everything from creating change logs based on the pull requests, congratulating contributors, making releases, and actually publishing the code. It does it all for you with a plugin system so that you can graft it to whatever type of code you're releasing. And cool enough, someone actually has a PR up right now to add a plugin to support Scala projects, something that I've never even thought about. Just some random person in the community is adding it. And how Auto really kind of got off the ground was with that initial blog post from Artsy. You can go back and look at the GitHub star count, and there's a sharp curve. I like to call it the Orta cliff, because past that, it's only been like a steady rise. It really started out there, and I thank them.
Yeah, so at Artsy, we'd had a really interesting thing at the time. We were talking a lot about how we do releases, and we were using semantic release, which I think is a fairly popular release tool in the community, where like you have a git commit that triggers the release process. But we had these projects that were chained together in many different repos, which leads well into our topic today. And we had to sort of build this like complex release process, and people would forget to like add the semantic commits because it wasn't actually a part of our workflow. We were just using it for releasing. So it was like this weird sort of like bolt-on thing. And we were like, why isn't this just like every time we merge a PR, that is the unit of change? Because it is. It's like the unit of change that we sort of like use to say, okay, now it's good for release. And I had started writing my own version of what Auto is, and it's a hard problem, super hard problem. And one of the members on my team, Chris, he was like, we should just find something else out there that already does this. Surely somebody else has written it. And Orta went off and did some research. And
there was one.
Yep. And here we are today.
Auto is by no means the first tool that solves this problem. As Justin just mentioned, like semantic release basically does what Auto does. There's also like probably half a dozen other tools out there that do the same thing, but based on pull requests. But the like key differentiator with Auto was how it worked in a monorepo. Something that a lot of the code that I ended up writing at Intuit ended up being in a monorepo, and like the base case for us was has to work with enterprise, has to work in a monorepo, and basically every open source tool at the time didn't work in enterprise and didn't work in a monorepo, so we set out to build our own.
Well, it seems like a really good transition point. Why don't we talk about what a monorepo is?
Yeah, so the monorepo we're talking about isn't all of your company's code in one repo. That is a bit different of idea. I think that's called a monolith.
So companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and other large tech companies have made this choice to have like a single repo. So if you used to Git, you can imagine that they just have like one repo for all their code across all their company. And like Google's pretty notorious for this. That's a vastly different use case than sort of monorepo we're talking about here. You can still have a monorepo and not have a monolith, but you'll find the idea of a monorepo, so like many different packages in the same repo, is actually really common, especially in the JavaScript ecosystem. So tools like Babel, React, Next.js, Jest, if you've heard of or used any of these tools, they all use this idea of a monorepo to help simplify maintainers' lives.
Yeah, and that's for Auto. Auto is built in such a way that we wanted all of it to be very reusable, and so that's why we have our CLI in one package and our core in another package, and then all of our plugins rely on the core, while the CLI can just use the plugins with ease. It's also like a great tool if you're building open source packages and the thing you're building your packages for is already in a monorepo. There's a high chance that that one function that you need to use is actually distributed in a package in the monorepo. Whereas if everything was built into one package, you'd probably only have one entry point into the CLI and wouldn't actually be able to access any of the internal code. But the monorepo allows you to kind of create an API for multiple levels in your project.
It's important to note that like tools like Auto, which help you release monorepos, are one of many things in the ecosystem that makes this conceptual notion of having many packages in a single repository that are released independently possible. And we'd be really remiss in our duties here if we didn't talk about Lerna, which is one of probably the most popular in the JavaScript ecosystem tools for managing multiple packages.
Yeah, it's a tool that comes with all the parts, all the sub-tools that you would need to manage a monorepo. So like a monorepo isn't just one thing, there's multiple parts to managing it. And that's kind of, I like to categorize all the available tools into 3 buckets. You have your installers. Those are tools that help you manage the dependencies of a monorepo. They can also just be tools that help you manage your dependencies in general. You have task running, which since now you have all these packages, all your packages may have their own tasks, such as linting, testing, and building. The task runners are meant to make running those tasks really easy from both the root of your monorepo, where all the packages are accessible, and then each package individually. And then the last step of that, those are the tools you use in your day-to-day. The last step is the publisher. And the publisher is kind of where Auto comes in and makes the developer experience really nice in a JavaScript monorepo. But in the end, it's actually all still based on the Lerna implementation and really relies pretty heavily on it.
Yeah, so if we want to go back and look at these like 3 categories conceptually with like examples, so your installer would very much be like Yarn, which is a very common thing that's bundled with Lerna for managing a monorepo. And the reason why Yarn is often bundled is because it has this notion of workspaces, which allows it to install or think about dependencies in multiple subpackages. I guess it's notable that the latest version of npm 7 also sort of like conceptually has that notion baked in. If we go up a next level and think about like a task runner, this is really firmly where Lerna sort of lies and shines. But again, you know, sort of it's a bit of a gray area, right? Because Yarn also can do some of that with the notion of workspaces. So you can say Yarn workspace, you know, whatever, to run a particular command in a particular workspace. But the same is true with Lerna, and I think like Lerna, it makes this a little bit easier because you can just run something across all of your sub packages really simply. And then the publisher's side, Andrew, like you're saying, where Auto really sits and kind of very nicely sits on top of Lerna to do that. So I guess you could just use Lerna if you're like manually deploying. But
Yeah, Lerna is like the batteries included monorepo tool. It is an installer. You can run Lerna Bootstrap to install all your dependencies and link up the folders. You can use it to run tasks, just like Justin was saying, and then it has a bunch of great publishing tools. But I'd say of those three capabilities it has, it is good and bad at some of them. So like first getting into monorepos, I tried to set it up for the project I was working on at work, and the install took 6 minutes. And that is super long. We were using Lerna Bootstrap, and it was just slow as hell. And then Yarn Workspaces came into our lives and made monorepos a thing we could actually use, because Yarn's Workspaces was basically a drop-in replacement for Lerna Bootstrap that was just like literally 6 times faster. Like it took a minute to install our dependencies instead of 6 minutes. So in terms of an installer, Lerna's a pretty shitty installer. I think it's a pretty good task runner. It will run your tasks. It'll run them in a certain order. It knows about the topological sorting of your monorepo. The topological sort literally just means what packages depend on what and what needs to build when. So you can run Lerna run build and then give stream as a flag, and the stream flag tells Lerna to show you all the output while it's going, and you can see, oh, it's actually building all of my packages in the order that they need to be built. So as a task runner, it's pretty good. Then, in my opinion, Lerna really shines as a publisher. It may not be the most automated experience, but like the amount of flags and different configuration and the way the commands are set up really allow you to release your code in the way you want to. It doesn't really like bake in any of its assumptions of how you should release your code. It gives you all the freedom in the world.
Yeah, for sure. One of my favorite features is this notion where you can either have all your sub-packages in your monorepo be versioned the same way, so have this like fixed versioning scheme, or they can be versioned independently, where they can have their own sort of versioning independent of their peers. This was something that we used at Artsy for our design system. So our design system is a small monorepo. It has 2 packages in it, the design system itself and the site that like powers the design system. And you know, we version these things independently because they change independently, right? And I also just love how like Auto just hooks straight into that. So that's cool.
Yeah, you guys were big proponents of that, because when I was originally building Auto, in reading through GitHub issues, I was like, oh, fixed versioning, that's what everybody uses. That's all I'm going to code. And then it quickly became apparent that a lot of people rely on multiple versions in their repo.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about like this versioning thing and like its different use cases. So, you know, I outlined how Artsy had used it, where we have these 2 things that are bundled together in this repo, but they're fundamentally different. They're related, but they're different. But if you think about a tool like Babel, which I'm fairly certain uses fixed versioning, Babel is building a single tool, but they're breaking down these packages for maintainability and you know, whatever their justifications are. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, they want all those to be representative of the same version of the tool.
So yeah, it makes debugging so much easier. One of the biggest bugs we'd always get from our users for our design system at Intuit was, oh no, this thing's not being styled right, or it's not working in the right way. And our first question was always, do you have the same version of everything installed? And it like that cured 90% of the problems. And if you don't have a fixed version, it's a lot harder to grok how all of your packages are actually interacting with each other and what version ranges are actually acceptable. If it's all just one version, it's one version, and you can move on to the next problem.
Yeah, I find that idea of if you're going with an independent mode for your monorepo to control your versioning, how you designate or how you signal to sub packages, like if they should be bumped or not, is an interesting sort of problem. So I'm gonna say to you what I think the behavior in Auto is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like if you're releasing on pull requests with Auto and you have Lerna configured as independent, then if you make changes into packages and then you're saying, hey, this is a minor update, then both of those packages will be released with a minor update. And there are various other tools that can help you manage deployments, and they have different signals for how they manage versioning. So again, we talked about semantic release at like the early part of this, right? So it could be that it's a commit of a certain file in a certain package that has like a label that's prefixed to it.
Yeah, that's definitely something you could say is like not the best part of auto, is that if maybe you don't want both of those packages to have a minor bump, maybe you just want one to have a minor bump and one to have a patch. That's not really possible with auto. The way it is possible is you break up your one PR into two PRs and have much more granular pull requests in your repository, which really is a plus. It is kind of a burden on the developer to do that splitting up themselves, but it allows your consumers to have like two independent changelog items of, oh, this package fixed a bug and this one added a feature, and you can get that granularity.
Yeah, and it's a great point that you're talking about here about like this notion of like the generation of changelog, which Auto does really well, and other tools in this space also do really well. And it's a thing that you have to consider carefully when you're thinking about a monorepo, because again, it depends on how your packages are consumed. If they're consumed together, like the Babel packages, then maybe you just want a singular changelog to say, hey, these all things change together. But if they're not, if they're consumed independently, maybe it's a bit of a different story.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the things Auto aims to solve. It'll even create package level changelogs, because like a lot of the time when I'm upgrading a dependency, the first thing I go do is like look if they have a changelog MD, and if that encompasses a whole monorepo, it can kind of be a little too much when you're trying to do some dependency updates, and it's much nicer to have that granular approach.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree. How about we talk about some of the other tools in this space? So Andrew, you wrote a blog post on dev.to that covers a lot of this, and we'll link that in the show notes. But one of the tools that really caught my eye, because it sort of fell in all of these different camps, is Rush. Now, I haven't investigated this tool a lot, but tell us about it.
Rush is a really interesting tool. Most tools built after Lerna have like the same set of assumptions, that you're going to have a root level package JSON and then a package JSON for each project, and your repo is going to generally look and function like it did before it was a monorepo. But with Rush, they kind of like just throw that out the window and take their own approach to the whole problem. Rush is in the similar vein of Lerna in that it tries to be everything all again. It's an installer, it's a task runner, and a publisher. The way that it's different is it'll actually install every single dependency into a common folder rather than at the root level or at the package level. I think they do this to get around some of the weirdness that other approaches take. The normal monorepo relies on the node package resolution, so it basically looks up in directories for node modules, and if it finds a package there, it's going to use it. And sometimes that can kind of lead to undesired behavior when you're developing your monorepo. It might not be all that obvious that your sub package has a slightly different version of React that it installed, and then now all of a sudden React's telling you, hey, you got multiple versions of React, what's going on here? So they try to get around that problem by just taking a completely different approach.
Yeah, I find their like sim linking strategy to be pretty interesting. There's this other kind of weird problem that happens with monorepos, is because like if you're using Yarn and Lerna particularly, so you install all your dependencies and they're hoisted sort of by default up into your sort of like main level, your root level in your repo has like all your dependencies installed, and then pretty much the only thing that ends up in the node modules directory for all your sub packages is like the executables that you might need. If you ever have a package that does something naughty, like try to directly access something in node modules, which it shouldn't outside of the require scope, but if you do, that will break for you because the package is not there. It's somewhere else. So this approach is really interesting. The other thing that you pointed out in your blog post that I thought was really interesting is how they do versioning. Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about that?
They take of all the tools we've talked about, Auto included, they take such a different approach. None of it's automated, and it's all kind of reliant on the developer making a pull request to run one of Rush's command. They have to run the change command, and like it's just included as part of the pull request and then merged into the repo as normal. And then when somebody runs rush publish, they'll actually pick up all those change files and then construct the change logs and the releases out of them. They take the versioning policies set forth by Lerna and kind of take them a step further, whereas like Lerna's an all or nothing, where like either your entire repo has one version or everything has separate versions and you got to manage that shit yourself. Rush have a version policies where you can make separate parts of your repo have those fixed or independent versions. So this might be useful if, say, you have a core collection of packages for your application, like your CLI and your core code, that you want it to still have that fixed versioning so that those are always in sync. But you may have a bunch of plugins or a bunch of apps in the same repo that can have the independent versioning policy that will give you that much more fine-grained granularity.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I thought that was super unique, especially just because managing these are managing versions in particular are often a pain point. This also reminds me of another tool, and I think Atlassian put this out, but it's called changesets. I've been seeing this a lot more recently. So from what I know about it, you have this changeset file that you would put in your pull request, and that's going to list out like what the version bump should be, if any, and like what changes are included in that change set. It's hard to say. But anyway, my understanding is once you merge that, then the change set will be sort of rolled up, version calculated, and that will result in a release. Maybe not as sort of broad scoped as Rush, because it hits more in just like the release process and the version control, kind of like in the same vein as Auto, but it's an interesting, also an interesting approach.
Yeah, they take a much different approach to automation than Auto does. Auto is basically like, Auto's going to do it all for you. You run it on the CI, you don't touch it. Whereas with chain sets, like once you merge the pull request with the chain set, I think there's actually a bot you have to install to your repo. Then the bot opens up a pull request where you have like the next version is being released, and then I think it updates it as PRs are merged. So you kind of feel like you have a more of a hand in the process as the versions are going out, and you don't have to release every pull request. You might release every few pull requests.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's cool. It's an interesting trade-off. So one of the challenges that Auto has sometimes, and it's a big enough of a trade-off that it's mentioned in the top of the README, is you can merge too fast. If you're merging PRs really quickly, then they can sort of clobber each other. And I have personally tried to sort of solve this within Artsy's infrastructure by having like our builds, our merge builds sort of queue up. Not perfect though. Not perfect, because if you're making a changelog change, it will create a new commit, and then that sort of invalidates some of the stuff that's like queued up. So
yeah, that used to be a bigger problem. Like there was a large window where you could fuck up your releases if you merged something during that window. But thanks to an open source contribution from somebody looking at semantic releases code, we figured out how they were doing it, and now we do it as literally late in the process as possible. So I think there's only like a few seconds where if you merged a PR, bad things would happen. So now I merge a lot more nilly-willy, but I left the warning in the docs because it's still something.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's a good point. I haven't personally seen that be an issue in a long time. So
yeah, very long time. And going back to change sets, I actually tried to make a change set plugin for Auto, kind of like bending the worlds together, but I don't really like the idea of like a tool taking, like adding and removing files from my project as it's doing its thing. So instead of having a change set file, I opted for using the pull request body as a place to write your change set. You get the same control as an owner of the repo, since you can edit any pull request description. If somebody writes really bad release notes, or maybe English isn't their first language and they don't get the point as smoothly across as you want, you can go in and edit it and still have really nice change logs. That's kind of a hidden feature of Auto. When I tell people that it can do that, they're like, wait, what?
Yeah, I remember when that was added. I was super excited about that. Long ago, one of my multitude of side projects was trying to build a bot for Auto, which like helped you do some of that stuff. But unfortunately, I never really finished that. But shout out to GitHub's Probot team, because Probot the robot is awesome. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm more or less against building layers on top of Auto. I think I've built a tool that's like mostly simple enough that you should be able to use it pretty easily. And the second you introduce another layer on top of it, it just complicates the process. Like, there were multiple initiatives at Intuit to like kind of create a Jenkins build wrapper around Auto that just kind of set it up on your repo automatically. But that was never really all that automatic, and it never really worked. And all it ended up doing was having people using Auto that didn't know what Auto did or how it should work, and then a lot of burden on me to support those people and explain the tool.
Yeah, I think that that notion of sort of over abstraction or wrapping your dev tools in too many different layers so you get far away from the tool is like a big challenge, and especially in this space of monorepos where it can seem like there's a lot going on anyway. This makes me think of another tool in your list, and I don't mean that as a detriment to this tool, but so there's this tool called NX, which is kind of, I think of like a way to just like bootstrap projects almost, because they have like so many like plugins to sort of help you build things, but
yeah, in my doc, I only call it a task runner, but that's mainly because it kind of throws out the idea of what your monorepo is. Like, the monorepos we've been talking about up until this point are kind of like a collection of node packages. NX is built for maintaining a collection of apps. So, like, they don't have a concept of publishing, and then adding publishing is kind of hard because there's not even package JSONs for each of your apps. They're just, it's way more configuration over convention, and they kind of throw out all those normal monorepo conventions out the window. If we're putting like NX, Rush, and Lerna on a scale, like Lerna's at the left, NX is at the right, and Rush is in the middle, where NX doesn't look anything like Lerna in the end.
For sure. So that notion of building sort of multi-tenant apps is definitely the way that I discovered NX. So I was experimenting with this idea at Artsy, and I was at the time calling it Artsy Studio, and I was trying to build this thing off of Next.js to essentially have just that. If you were going to build an internal dev tool, you had this like one sort of monolithic or multi-tenant application that could break down into sub-apps in the same way that we're talking about monorepos here. That same idea. So NX is a tool that does that really well. I think this is actually something that another framework called Blitz.js, which builds off of Next.js, is doing really, really well. So sort of the...
Well, maybe not for
Yeah. Well, they have their fork of Next.js now. So it sort of started off conceptually in the same sort of place, and now they actually have documentation for having multi-tenant apps. So it's pretty neat. It's cool.
Yeah, definitely something I'm going to be looking at soon. Monorepos can definitely bend to how you want to use them.
Yeah, so that's when we start getting into this notion of a larger monorepo. Like, I mean, obviously not to the same scale, but like the things that Google would think about when they look at their single monorepo with all. So again, to reframe that, we've been really talking about like mostly JavaScript ecosystem, like mini packages and a single repo, but the idea of like multi-tenant architecture is something that's still pretty fascinating too, because in the same way that like one of the primary motivations for putting many small packages in a monorepo is because if you don't, you have to deploy these things independently from separate repos. You have to have separate CI processes. You have to have all this stuff that's all separate. And God forbid they actually depend on each other in some way. Then you have to have tools like Renovate to update versions of them between deployments, and that's a whole nother thing.
Let alone getting a pull request out to test something. So like the problem that really led me to monorepos at the start was our app's architecture had like 26 different repos, and for me to make a change that I could see in the app, I'd have to go through like 3 or 4 different repos, making pull requests, publishing temporary versions, installing that to the next repo, and then going on and on and on until I could have like at the top level, here's my feature. And getting from point A to point B took me like sometimes an hour. and then if something changes in the end, like gotta go back and do all that again. So putting it all in the same repo really helped with that problem.
Yep, we were at Artsy. So I'd come in and we'd started building a design system, which we call Palette, which is its own thing. We have our sort of site, which is called Force, which is its own thing. And then we had this like kind of not fork of Force, but this like new sort of re-envisioning of Artsy. That was this like big sort of React application that was in its own repo called Reaction. But there was a like directional graph. So Palette was consumed by Reaction, which was consumed by Force. So people were, at the time that I started, they would be like, okay, semantic commit for this thing, it releases. I need to remind myself to do a pull request, so I'm going to go to this other package after that thing is released and do an extra pull request to update the version, and then go to this other thing. And I was just like, what are we doing?
Yeah, and then you do all that, and then you figure out, oh shit, this one package I forgot about, I should have updated and tested, and that's where all the failing tests actually are. If your code's in a monorepo, it all has to build, it all has to test, it all has to win. So like that is one of the biggest ones.
Yeah, for sure. I think with DevTools, it's always it's always important to keep in mind. It's like, this classic idiom, using the right tool for the job, but also just identifying when you need to choose a tool versus when to the environment. So when we were thinking about policy, we chose two tools that helped us solve this problem. So Auto was instrumental in that, which is why we started using it a lot. And Renovate, which I mentioned previously, which is a dependency manager, or a update, not a dependency manager. It's an automated bot to update dependencies. So as new dependencies are published, it'll automatically create which you can merge to update your dependency. Those two tools together helped us like build this kind of like CI Rube Goldberg machine where it would like, you would do it and the bots would just like open these PRs and merge them and publish and do all this stuff. And I was very proud of the fact that it worked, but then stepping back and we're like, oof, there's a lot going on here that doesn't need to be. So eventually we wrapped Reaction back into Force, and we still use Auto, and we still use Renovate, but like for different level of problems.
Yeah, you want to get away from herding the cats at some point.
Yeah.
Let's get back into talking about task running, because that's something that doesn't become a problem until it does. So when you have a small amount of packages in a repo, it can be pretty quick. Like running commands might not take that long, running builds might not take that long. But once you start getting into the lots and lots of packages area, things start to get a lot slower. And that's mainly because like the early tools, Learn as Run and Exec, have no concept of previous work done. So when you're running a build and you find that there's a type error in your app, you have to rebuild every single package that comes before it to actually get back to that build error and get on to the next one. So a lot of these tools now that are coming out take a different approach and try to make that experience better. So we've already talked about a few of them. Rush does this. They'll actually take your dependency graph and build your packages in the right order, and then if they don't directly depend, they'll parallelize it. But it also has a rebuild command where it has like some knowledge of what has been done and will only build what it needs to.
Yeah, this is sort of like classic computing problem, right? It's like wanting to make your tasks as lazy as possible. I'm gonna inject a quick shout out to former colleague, current and future former colleague, David, who is the author of Patch Package, which we can and probably will do a whole episode on by itself because it's magic. But at Artsy, he also wrote this tool called Gudetama, which is like the same character of the Japanese like little naked
Yeah.
guy. That's really, anyway, which it does the same sort of thing for your CI, right? It looks at like, okay, when was the last time this command ran? What were the conditions around it? And sort of like builds, like hashes that fact. And so that tool for CI, but like these tools, these task runners, it's sort of important to have a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think the first tool that is doing it in kind of like a SaaS oriented way is NX. Like that's kind of the main selling point to me is they have their NX cloud, and since it's not convention and it is configuration, they know a lot more about your repo because you tell them a lot about your repo, and then through that they're able to do those selective builds and maybe not build all your code before getting to that one error again.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I don't know much about as much about what's new in this space as I would like. We'd sort of like highlighted some tools that we were excited about, and we're on this notion of like task runners and that being really a little bit slow. Monorepos themselves can be slow, like doing operations on monorepos, and I mean, of course, if we were talking about like monorepos from the like Google level, you have a whole different like notion of speed, right? Because like they have to think about how fast is their version control. But if we narrow back down, even if you're building a monorepo for something like Babel or just but there's this project called TurboRepo that's out in the wild, and I've heard about it and it's interesting. But Andrew, do you know any more about that?
Yeah, I've actually had a few one-on-ones with Jared at this point to talk about it, and it really takes the ideas that
this is
Jared Palmer. Right? It takes those ideas that we just talked about for like Rush, where it has local rebuilds, and NX, where it has cloud rebuilds, and does it all. It's basically a drop-in replacement for a lerna run, where you just do turbo run, and instead of doing the whole topological sort of your repo and linting everything in order and testing everything in order and then building everything in order, it knows about all of that and can parallelize it to some degree, and then it has a cache, both local and remote, that you can use. Why would you want a remote cache? Well, say you just hired a developer to your team and you have this huge monorepo that requires lots of building, lots of linting, and those tasks take a long time. When your new developer clones your repo and starts running turbo commands on it, it can actually pull the results of those commands from the cloud and pull them to your local cache, so that your build might not take 10 minutes, it might take 11 milliseconds just to run the build, because like, hey, we're just downloading things from a cache and then using them. So I think it's a pretty exciting tool that'll really help a lot of those larger open source projects.
Yeah, it's really awesome to hear that. It makes me think of like, so a lot of CI services will do a similar sort of thing with like Docker level or Docker layer caching, where they'll have like, you have Docker containers for all your things, but they'll have at least like the layer caches built up, so you can have a hotter start, but it's that locally, which is really interesting. I've always thought that I'd sort of have been waiting for something that does the opposite, that just like builds everything in the cloud. Like you have like 1,000 lambdas that start up and like just do these like little
You don't want to
processes
do that. I've done that. You don't want to do that.
On a related note, though, it makes me also think of have you heard of Mighty Browser?
Yeah, I was just reading about it yesterday. It ruffled a bunch of feathers.
It did, but it uses that. How far have we? What have we done? It uses that same notion of like, I'm going to push all this work up to the cloud, right? So it's like doing that, except for a web browser.
Yeah.
Oh, Chrome making your fan spin up? That's fine. We'll run it on a server.
I don't know how I feel about Mighty quite yet. There's lots of implications to running your browser in the cloud, but another example of the same thing of offloading work to the cloud that's pretty interesting is Google Stadia. If you don't know what Stadia is, it is gaming in the cloud. So say you want to play Crysis 2 at max settings on your phone. Well, you might have some problems because your phone might not be powerful enough to play that, but you can count on Google servers being powerful enough to play it and then stream it to your phone. So like, I think that's a super exciting place to be. Like, we might someday get to the point where your device doesn't really matter because your device is elsewhere.
Yeah, maybe that should be a whole episode on its own.
Yeah.
It also makes me think of just like other tasks that are being pushed to the cloud. So development in the cloud using like a web-based editor is not necessarily a new thing.
Oh, it's a very old
back
thing.
Around, yeah. But I think back to the tools that I'm sort of familiar with. It's like Cloud9, which I think AWS owns now, but like, is one of the first like web-based like development environments. And now we have, GitHub has like its sort of like own notion of like what it means to have like a workspace in the cloud. And I don't know, I think it's also an interesting thing of like pushing your IDE stuff.
But it's funny though, because it's like a kind of what was old is new again. Because like we're young and we never developed like this. But my dad, when he was learning programming, he had a computer that wasn't really doing the work. It was hooked up into a mainframe where like all the work was done. So we're now kind of just doing that, but over the air, which is like it's funny how like the start of computing is now becoming modern bleeding edge computing.
For sure. I feel like
we steered
wandering
way off
far
course.
off the monorepo topic.
Yeah.
But I do, there's that is a common trend, and it's really interesting, and I hope that in future episodes we can sort of highlight some of the other like ways that sort of notion of we originally did things one way and then we shifted another way, and sort of the pendulum swings back. There's a lot of that these days, and it's really interesting.
Static websites.
Oh yeah, static websites for sure.
Yeah.
It's an exciting time, I think. Cool. Well, shall we wrap up this episode?
Yeah, sure. That was a great talk we had about monorepo tooling. Maybe a little bit all over the place, but forgive us. This is our first podcast. Like, what are you going to expect?
For sure.
Okay. Let's bounce back and forth with these. I'll go first with my dev tool tip of the week. This one is a classic developer tool, not in the same vein of the ones that we've been talking about, but Alfred. Like, everybody's been telling me to install it since I got a MacBook like 10 years ago, but I finally installed it, and by God, it's really good. I've grappled with Spotlight so much on so many computers. Like, the example I give to my girlfriend is I try to open Spotify with Spotlight, and it just keeps opening up the installer. But Alfred doesn't do that. It remembers what I chose.
Yeah, for sure. Alfred's great. It's one of the sort of instrumental things in our workflow.
Yeah, I haven't really gotten into the workflows yet.
Oh yeah, they're good. Like
making it really good. Like what sold me on like getting it after so long was the 1Password integration. Like I got my identity stolen a few times last year on various different sites, and was like no more. And I finally went all in on 1Password, and it's been great. I really like it. And Alfred has the ability to take your entries in 1Password and just open them and log you in automatically, which is just like mind-blowing.
Yeah, both tools, very awesome. I also use them, highly recommended. I'll switch over to my dev tooltip, which is a little bit different, not necessarily a personal tool. One of the problem areas that I like a lot is thinking about refactoring, especially automated refactoring at a large scale. So maybe if you're in the JavaScript ecosystem, you've heard of code mods. Facebook has a tool of the same name, code mod, that like sort of does this idea of like having automated refactorings. And React uses this a lot. So they'll release a version that might have like some syntactical change or something, and to like ease developer adoption, they'll write a code mod for it. But to really sort of like have that sort of functionality at a broader scale across potentially many languages, there's this really interesting tool called semgrep. So if you've ever used grep before, you might know what that is. It's like a simple CLI tool to just find things. But this is a lot
fancy
more
word for searching.
Yeah. This is a lot more powerful, and it gives a lot of semantic information about the code. So it's like you can search on very specific patterns, and it's incredibly powerful and pretty cool. This is not the only tool in this space. There are others, and unfortunately I can't remember their names now, but I will look them up and put them in show notes. There's one in particular, I think it's called like Hive or something. I don't know. But it's made by one of the people at SourceGraph, and it's also really cool and has some other interesting properties. Or maybe it's Comb. Anyway, one of those. I'll put that in the show notes, though.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how that works, because the code mod tools you mentioned, I'm pretty sure they work on ASTs. Do you know if this works in a similar way?
It's
just magic to you?
I'm not. Well, no, it's not complete magic, but I'm not 100% sure. So this other tool that I'm trying to think of the name of, I think it actually might be Comb. Works a little bit more magically, where it does not run on ASTs, but it has this like generic sort of pattern matching that it does. But it's like syntactically very smart. Semgrep is like somewhat similar in that, but again, I don't know specifically if it's parsing your source code and turning it into an AST. One thing that I'll say about SemDev in particular, obviously this isn't a tool I have used myself personally, but they also have this collection of patterns that you can download. So they'll have like, hey, here's how you can find these security, like this classification of products. So I just thought that was a really interesting addition.
That's pretty cool. It's like ESLint with refactoring.
Yeah.
So my next tool is a node version manager. There's a whole bunch of them, but a whole bunch of them are really hard to use and assume the wrong things. The one that I've settled on after years of searching between MVM, NodeEnv, and all the rest is TJ's N. Very simple, hard to Google repo. It's just like dead simple node version management. You run N auto, it detects what version it needs to install, and it installs it for you without any fuss and without messing up the path on your system to Node, which is like a real key thing for me. I want Node to be where Node is, and not to have like weird hoops being jumped through on my terminal just to run Node.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe I'll give a shout out in a similar vein. I don't use N, but I use this tool called ASDF, which is maybe not necessarily as directly ergonomic for just Node, but the nice thing is it manages versions for a lot of things. So I use it for Node, I use it for Ruby, I use it for Elixir. It is got pretty good broad plugin support, which has been pretty nice. But again, talking about the CLI ergonomic perspective, sometimes these tools are a little bit hard because it's hard to remember the command that you're using. So I'm actually going to give another tool tip about this tool called Fig. So Fig is a early startup. They just went through YC recently, but it's essentially they have a grand vision for what it will be. But yeah, it's autocomplete for your terminal, but it's like really good autocomplete. I do have access.
Yeah, I've been lusting after it. Like,
I can send you an invite code.
Ooh, you should send me an invite code, because it looks so much nicer. Like if you've never built a CLI before, you may not know what goes into giving bash or ZSH completions, and let me tell you, it sucks.
Yeah.
Typically, the tool will have to expose a separate command called install completions, where it will like literally put bash code somewhere on your system in the hopes that your terminal will use it for completions. And those completions, they're not the best looking. They're just plain text. Depending on the shell you're using, they may not be the easiest thing to use, and it's just really hard to like make them for the random tool that you're using. The nice thing I've seen about Fig is that it just like it's a very simple JSON structure to describe what should be completed, and then it's all done within the UI of your OS, not like constrained to just your terminal, where like menus might not be the best thing in a terminal. Those might live better in the OS land. So Indeed. How have you liked it so far?
Indeed. I like it a lot. It's incredibly magical, and they've got a lot of broad coverage for a lot of the things that I use. So it just works for most things, which is amazing. I talked to the founders of that a little while back, and how they built that is just fascinating. So there's like this process that wraps your shell. So every like all your commands are sort of like running through that, and then when they see, hey, you're like trying to type something out, they actually use the accessibility API on Mac to figure out like, okay, where's your terminal? Where's the input? Here, let me render this thing near you. And it's technically complicated and very magical, but it just works like a dream. It's great.
Yeah, we'll have to get those guys on.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, the coolest integration I've seen so far is when you type npm install, you can tab complete and search npm straight from the terminal,
Yeah,
which is just like crazy.
A recent addition. I think they're hiring if you're looking for a job out there, world. Maybe they'll give me some swag for pitching for them.
Yeah, send swag, please.
Yeah. One of their long-term visions, which I think is really fascinating, and maybe even something that I would like to experiment with in the future, is like, what does the future of the terminal look like? Like, if we could re-envision this thing that's really hasn't changed much in all these years, what might that look like? I know that's gonna make a lot of people feel a lot uneasy because they're just like, I just want my tools simple, man. But
yeah, it's always crazy to me that like computers started at the terminal, and now like the majority of computer users aren't gonna know how or what a terminal does, but that was like literally the only way to interface with a computer back in the day.
Yeah. And still oftentimes one of the better ways, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've recently been discovering the use of pipes and all that good stuff. I've never really been able to like really understand when I would want to pipe things to other commands and through commands, but I'm getting it more and more, which leads me into my last tooltip, which is my meeting light. I recently built a light that is connected up to my computer and automatically detects whether I'm in a meeting and turns the light on. It's actually on right now over there. And to do that, I used a terminal command called lsof, and I piped that into grep, and now I actually understand what pipes do. So, 10 years, check mark.
Yeah, so you have a good write-up on that. We'll add that to the show notes too.
Yeah.
I guess
still need to hang it.
Oh yeah. The last thing for me is not necessarily a tool, more of a framework. I've always been super interested in front-end frameworks, as they are. I mean, I got my start early, like in the Angular days, and I did a lot with Vue and React and Svelte and Marco and like, I don't know, a lot of them. They're just really interesting technologies. There's a lot of constraints. It's a hard space, and I really love to see people innovating. So the team behind Snowpack and Skypack, which Snowpack is a tool to sort of help you bundle things or something with ESM. I don't know. I'm sorry. I just butchered that. Skypack is a CDN for ESM, which I have a good grasp on what that is. But they're building a web framework called Astro. And it reminds me a lot of Svelte in a lot of ways. So Svelte is a front-end framework or components interface, I guess. That's the compiler based. So you have a template, and the compiler goes through, looks at what you put in the template, and then generates out runtime code, whether that's HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So Astro does that same sort of thing, but it's a little bit different. By default, it ships no JavaScript. So you build a page, and you have this Astro file, which looks a lot like a Svelte component or like an HTML file, really. And you can import components, and they can be React components, they can be Svelte components, in the future Vue components. You can use all these things together, and by default, it just server renders them and doesn't rehydrate them. But you can add this little tag to say, hey, I want this thing to become interactive when it's visible, or on the page load, or when the main thread is idle. And it will only sort of hydrate that one component in that one specified way. So they're flipping the sort of emphasis where we only ship JavaScript when you explicitly say, hey, I need interactivity. In my mind, this is huge because most pages for most things don't actually need JavaScript. It's like, I think of Artsy, and we're a huge React app. We use GraphQL and Relay, and we have like styled systems and styled components and all of these things, and it's like many layers of complexity, and performance is an issue for us for sure, but most of our pages have very little interactivity. So it's that notion where if you flip this on its head, maybe you can get some better performance. So shout out to that. I'll include their intro post to that. I think it's still in closed beta right now.
Yeah, that seems exciting. Still very early on, but exciting. I like how all these tools are taking a page from Next.js and using the pages folder. Like that is such great DX.
Yeah, for sure. Huge shout out to Next.js and the whole Versal team. Our devtools.fm site hosted on Versal and using Next.js. So it's great. It's good stuff.
Is that how you say it? I thought it was Vercel.
Oh no, maybe I said it wrong.
I'm sure I said their old name wrong too. I called it Zeet. I think it's Zeit. I don't know.
GIF, I don't know. See me.
Yeah, which one's peanut butter?
Indeed. All right, so we have taken a really long winding path, and maybe it's a good time to wind down.
So that was the intro episode of DevTools-fm. I think future episodes might be less of just the two of us and more of us talking with the people who are making these tools. Just kind of had to get our foot out the door with this first one. But it was a lot of fun talking with you, Justin. I hope we continue this. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. We'll share a link to the podcast episode, maybe on Twitter, and give us some feedback on what you liked, what you didn't, what you'd like to hear more of. Also, if you have ideas for guests, we already have a bit of a long list now, but if you make an interesting developer tool and you'd like to be on, or you know someone who does, please let us know.